15 days after George Floyd was killed, igniting a fury around the world, he was finally laid to rest today, buried next to his mother in Pearland, Texas, following an emotional funeral and celebration of life at the Fountain of Praise Church in Houston.
He was a pesky little rascal, but we all loved him.
I can feel that everyone is going to rise against injustice, and be sure that all human beings are treated the same so that George Floyd's memory will not be in vain.
As long as I'm breathing, justice will be served for Perry. Their officer showed no remorse while watching my uncle's soul leave his body. He begged and pleaded many times just for you to get up, but you just pushed harder. Why must this system be corrupt and broken? And these laws need to be changed. No more hate crimes, please. Someone said, make America great again. But when has America ever been great?
As you well know, Floyd's death led to protests across the nation and dozens of other countries, with calls for major changes to policing and law enforcement. Many have been pushing to defund or reallocate part of police budgets, like in Cambridge, where protesters rallied last night in front of City Hall, calling for a planned $4 million budget increase to instead go to larger community services. And demands for action on Beacon Hill are picking up steam as well. I'm joined now by Cambridge Police Commissioner Branville Jr., along with State Representative Russell Holmes of Boston. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Commissioner, you wrote a piece for a local news outlet in which you referenced Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie The Revenant, and let me read you a part. You said, in the eyes of some minorities, law enforcement is the grizzly bear mauling the minority community, while at the same time asking the minority community to rely on its kindness. Are people who have that viewpoint, are they right?
Well, they're right to be angry. I mean, they see historical injustices followed up by continued injustices and what seems to be an endless stream of injustices and committed by law enforcement against members of the minority community. So there's definitely a justification for it.
I'm sure you speak to some of your fellow chiefs across the country. Would a majority of police chiefs in America be willing to have said what you said in that piece?
Well, I'm not certain, but that's why I preface that with what worries me is that some of us don't see the fact that we're viewed that way.
Yeah. Representative, you are pushing legislation to reform law enforcement. Sadly, it's virtually the same legislation you've been pushing for years, long before the killing of George Floyd. Could you give us a very brief summary of what you're trying to do, and if you believe your odds of passage are any better this time around?
Sure. So the legislation, primarily the crux of it is, just like if you had a nail salon or hair beautician, you would need to have a license. And so the crux of it is, we're saying police officers have a much higher requirement than a nail salon or beauty salon. They should have a license. We should be able to go and search their license and see what certifications they have. And we should also be able to decertify them if something goes wrong. And it seems pretty standard that I was even in conversations today with police officers. They're not accustomed to that type of oversight, but it certainly is an oversight that I think the rest of society is accustomed to.
Commissioner, is that the kind of thing you'd support?
I definitely support it. I don't know that it's too much different than what exists now. Officers are already required to go through training and become municipally certified to hold the office of police officer. So, but I'm in favor of anything that puts checks and raises the cost for bad behavior.
So
well, one of the checks, of course you can, Representative. Go ahead.
So that's what I've heard from many of the officers today, that they have certifications. But not all police officers are the same. There are some police officers who have 800 hours of training. There are some who have 400 hours of training. There are some who have less. We as the public see all police officers as the same, but they don't all have the same training. You should have the same requirements if you're going to have a badge, and we should be able to understand what trainings you've had in the past.
Commissioner,
I agree with the representative that training should be uniform.
Commissioner, you were at a rally at Cambridge Common over the weekend, at which time you announced that most of the 8 can't wait list of reforms had already been implemented by the Cambridge police, but according to you, one was missing, namely the requirement that if a police officer is using excessive force, there is an obligation by statute for fellow officers to try to intervene to stop that from happening. Even with that announcement, some people in the crowd heckled you, booed you. What did you take? What was the message of that, even when you're talking about reform? What did you take away from that?
Well, I think that most people in the crowd cheered that announcement. I think that there was one person who still spoke out afterwards. But honestly, this department had already taken great strides to make sure that all of our policies elevated the value of human life and the sanctity of human life. So when those principles, when that reform, that 8 can't wait reform agenda was gained momentum because of Mr. Floyd's murder, I reviewed it, and initially I reviewed it and said, well, we do all of these things. And my legal advisor said, well, not that one. And I said, sure, the policy says exactly that, you have to report. It said, and then he reminded me that it said you have to report and not that you have to intervene. And it explained what happened if we didn't intervene, that we were civilly liable and criminally liable. But it walked up to the line, but it did not formally require it. So we just changed it. And so now Commissioner, all of our policies are in line with that.
I want to stay with you, Commissioner, for a second as well. There may have only been one person. I wasn't at the event, so I take you at your word. There were a lot of people last night outside Cambridge City Hall who were urging the city not to give a $4.1 million increase to the Cambridge Police Department, but rather use that proposed increase for a variety of other community services. Do you support that move?
I don't. One of the things is that the math was a little wrong. Our budget is actually only asking for a $2.5 million increase. Most of that tied to salary allegations. Well, $2.3 million of that. $2.3 million of that is tied to obligated salary increases. So, and the programs that we see, my budget is 98% personnel costs. So when you say you want to cut salaries, when you want to cut $2.8 million from it, $4.1 million from it, what you're doing is you're cutting positions, because all of my budget pays for salary. You're not cutting military equipment. We don't get military equipment. You're not cutting anything but people and salaries and positions.
Well, Representative, you know that this defund, and I think more appropriately called reallocate movement, is not just in Cambridge, but there's a lot of it, including in Boston. Do you support the concept, and as the Commissioner said, obviously the devil's in the details, do you support the concept of reallocating police dollars to other social and community services in your city?
I do. I think that the devil in the detail is still, we want to separate what we consider the right things for police to be doing versus the things that police are involved in today that really are much more human services. Our police are showing up for many things that are much more around addiction, many things that really should be dealt with around mental health. And is that a right call for police officers to show up at? I don't think so. And so that's really the separation and what we're trying to understand as I agree with the defund. It's not to make sure that folks are not still going on a police call as we would like them to show up to. It is just the things that are more appropriate should be done by human services.
How about that, Commissioner? Even if you're obviously, if you say it, it's so about 98% going to staffing. Should, as the representative said, maybe some of that staffing money not be for an officer, but for a social worker or some such person?
So I understand the thought process there, but I think it ignores the basic practicalities of the situation. The fact of the matter is that we're government's most visible representative and far more likely to encounter somebody in a mental health crisis or in the throes of substance use disorder. So, we respond to those things, and we're more likely to we need that specialized training. My department employs social workers already. We're already doing those things. And you want to take that structure that's already built and then move it and build it in some other form that might not be completely ready to handle it. I think it just ignores some practicalities. We already respond to, we're more likely to encounter those individuals than the professionals.
It is preferable.
Representative, I'm sorry.
As a landlord, I have had folks living in my home who, when I made the phone call, I knew I had to dial 911, but I knew when I made the phone call, this was more of a mental health challenge and not a police situation. I knew it. And so it would be great to have been able to dial 911, just like I asked for the fire, I asked for the police. It would have been great to say, can I ask for a person who has a mental health challenge as well? That's what we're asking for. And whether or not that comes from the police or not, I don't know.
Gentlemen, can I change the topic? We only have a minute left. You're both talking about changing rules of the road, changing statutes, but I assume you agree that law changes alone don't change the culture. And as I'm talking to you, I'm thinking of a grossly underreported SJC, Supreme Judicial Court decision 4 years ago, unanimous decision that said we can no longer assume that if a black man, a black person in general, but particularly a black man, runs away from police, we can no longer assume their guilt. The SJC said, but rather that he is attempting to avoid the recurring indignity of being racially profiled. That's a big hill to climb, Commissioner. Are you convinced we get there?
So, I mean, you got to understand me. I grew up in a very impoverished area, one plagued by violence, one where community policing was done at the end of a nightstick. Black and brown individuals were routinely pushed around mishandled by police. It's no secret, no coincidence that, I wrote a book on racial profiling. It's a problem. There are problems with the system. So, no, I don't think that that's an insurmountable hill to climb.
We only have 15 seconds, Representative. Are you hopeful?
Well, I'm very hopeful, but I also want to check the judicial system that we need them to open their courts, and we need them to also tell us why a black man is 8 times more likely to be sentenced than a white, and a Hispanic is 4 times more likely to be sentenced than a white. Then we still need them to answer that question as well.
Commissioner Branville, Bard, Representative Russell Holmes, we really appreciate both of your time. Thanks so much, gentlemen.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.